Hey everybody, what's going on? Eric here with Switch Adapted Toys, and today I'm going to be showing you how to adapt the Fisher-Price Linkimals Light Up and Learn Owl. If you like this video or if you found it helpful, make sure you hit the like button and hit subscribe because we're posting new videos all the time all about Switch Adapting Toys. And it really does help us out in a huge way, so thank you in advance for that. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. We're going to start by turning the toy over and removing all the screws on the back side of the toy. So with all those screws removed, we should be able to open up the toy. Now there are some wires that go to the battery compartment, so just be careful that you're not going to like yank the cords out. I'm just going to kind of set that aside just like that. And then the feet and the wings come off. They are also attached by a wire. So I'm just going to kind of slide those over to the side just like that. And what we need to do next is unscrew the two screws that hold this circuit board down. So with the circuit board unscrewed, we can flip it over and that will reveal all of the buttons that are on the back side that correspond to the buttons that are on the front of the toy. So whenever you push a button on the front of the toy, a little peg moves up and down and presses the button on the circuit board. So here we have some decisions to make. This is kind of a lot of buttons to adapt. I mean, you might be able to get all the wires in there, but that's kind of a lot. So I'm going to show you how to do one. You can decide which buttons you want to adapt, and then you can basically apply what I'm going to do here to pretty much any button on this circuit board. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adapt this music note, which corresponds to this button here on the circuit board. The reason why I like that music note is because the owl will sing a song. It's got a couple songs it sings, but it also will talk to other Linkimal animals. So if you have another Fisher-Price Linkimal, they all kind of start doing a song and dance. So I think that's the button I'm going to adapt, but again, if you have a different one that you want to do, you could just do the same thing to that button. So I just pulled off the little rubber button and I'm going to set it aside, and that reveals this disc. Alright, so if we look at our disc here, you can tell it's made up of two halves, and those two halves are kind of interwoven, kind of like that. And when the button is pressed, the little piece in there will make a connection between both of the halves of the disc, basically completing the circuit and setting off the toy. So what we need to do is we need to solder our headphone jack wires to this disc. But it's very hard to get solder just on half of the disc, but not the other half of the disc. If you've got solder that kind of crosses over, the toy will either just not work or it might just constantly go off. So what we can do instead is we can solder one of our headphone jack wires to this little circle next to the disc, and the other headphone jack wire kind of to this fatter section on the outside of this disc. We don't want to solder to this inside kind of C section. We want to solder to this outside backwards E section. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show you when I do it. But these discs are a little tricky to solder to. So I'll show you some tips and tricks so that we still get a good connection there. The first thing we need to do though is we need to drill a hole so that we can get our headphone jack wire into the toy. And since I'm going to solder to this disc, I'm just going to drill a hole basically straight out from it through the side of the toy here. If I was adapting a different button, I would just want to make sure that wherever I drill my hole, I'm not drilling into anything structural or any sort of electronic components, obviously. But you want to also just make sure that your cord has enough length to get there. Just make sure your drill bit is the same diameter of whatever headphone jack you're going to use. And all I'm going to do is drill a hole through the side of the toy. Now that we have that done, we need to prep our headphone jack wire. So I'm just going to set all this to the side for right now. So for the headphone jack wires, we like to buy them as splitters. That way I actually end up getting two cords for the price of one item. And I'm just going to snip off the male end of my headphone jacks, just like that. The next thing I need to do is remove some of the exterior casing. just like that. And you can see that I've got 3 wires inside my headphone jack wire. There's a red wire, a white wire, and a yellow wire. Now, your headphone jack wire colors may be completely different, but you should have 3. Sometimes one of your headphone jack wires won't even be in a sleeve. It might just be some bare wires, and that is totally fine. What we need to do is actually combine 2 wires together. Now, which wires you combine is important, and I'll explain that to you now. So our headphone jack wires have a TRS connector. That stands for tip, ring, sleeve. But many buttons that are out there only have a TS connector, or a tip and sleeve. So what we need to do on our headphone jack wires are combine the ring and sleeve wires together and have the tip wires separate. That way you just ensure that whichever button you're going to plug into your toy is going to work properly. So how do we figure out which wires are the ring and sleeve wires, the 2 wires that we need to combine? Well, we're going to need a couple different things. We're going to need a multimeter, and we're going to need a switch button. What I'm going to start by doing is removing a little bit of each of the casing on all 3 of my wires. So I've plugged in my switch button, and I just twisted 2 of the wires together, the tips, making sure they make contact with each other. And that's the first combination we're going to test out. And then on my multimeter, I'm going to switch it to ohms. So I've got my multimeter set to ohms, and what I'm going to do is just touch my probes together, and whenever I do that, you see that I get a reading on the multimeter, and whenever they are disconnected, it shows OL. That's basically telling me I've got a closed circuit and an open circuit. So we're going to use that to figure out which wires we need to combine on our headphone jack wires. So I'm just going to touch my probes to these wires, and you'll see I get a reading right away. So that's telling me that I've got a closed circuit right now, but the button is not being pressed, so it should be an open circuit. And whenever the button is pressed, then I should get a reading. So I know that this is the wrong combination of wires, and I'm going to try a different combination. So now I have the red and yellow wires twisted together, and I'm just going to touch my probes to the wire, and that says OL, which is good. And now I'm going to go ahead and press my button, and I should get a reading on the multimeter. There we go. So that's exactly what we are looking for. Whenever the button is pressed, we get a closed circuit, a reading on the multimeter, and whenever the button is released, it goes back to OL. So that is the combination of wires that I need. Now, again, your wire colors might be different. We find a lot of the times that the white wire will be the tip wire, so that's probably where I would start. But it's a good idea to test it just to make sure that you're not going to have any problems when you go to plug in a button once everything's finally adapted. So this is great. I'm all done here. I can go ahead and put this into my toy. But if one of my wires was bare, so say this white wire just didn't have any wire cover on it at all, I'd want to put a heat shrink wire cover or some electrical tape over this wire to protect it from accidentally touching something else inside the toy and shorting something out. You really just want the tips of the wires exposed, because that's what we're going to use to solder to the toy. So this wire is good to go, so let's go ahead and get it inside the toy. So now we can go ahead and fish our headphone jack wire through the side of the toy. And I'm just going to twist my wires together to make sure that they're nice and tight, because what I want to do before I solder them to the circuit board is I want to get a little solder on the wires themselves. It just makes it a lot easier when I go to actually solder it to the circuit board. So I'm just going to get some solder on the wires themselves. This does not need to look pretty, don't worry about it. You just want to make sure that you've got a good connection. So you basically just start at the base of the exposed wire, kind of work your way out to the tip, and you're almost like painting it on, for lack of a better word. So next what I want to do is use a flux pen, and I'm just going to kind of dab this disc, just kind of get it cleaned off and kind of wet. What this does, like I said, it helps clean it, but it also helps prevent the board from burning when I actually go to solder to it. So it's a really good thing to pick up if you don't have one already. And what I'm going to try to do is get a little bit of solder on this disc before I go to solder to it, just like that. And I'm going to get a little bead of solder there. I'm just going to snip these wires a little bit shorter. That way I just don't have a bunch of extra exposed wire. And then I can go ahead and solder them to the circuit board. You can give it a little bit of a tug, make sure that it's going to stay put. What I just want to double check is that I don't have any solder that's going from one half of that disc to the other, which that looks good. So what I'm going to do now is actually turn the toy on and plug in a switch and just make sure that everything works before we go ahead and put everything back together. There we go. So these connections are inherently weak. Just when you solder to those discs, they just tend to kind of pop off over time. So what we like to do is use some hot glue and just kind of glob it on there just to kind of lock everything into place. One thing you want to be careful of is that you don't have the tip of the hot glue gun touch your soldering points, because the heat could reheat the solder. So like you can see, I just globbed it all on there, and I just waited a second for the glue to cool off, but it's still tacky. And then I just kind of press it all down just to make sure that everything kind of gets, you know, secured and kind of locked into place. So another thing we want to do before we put everything back together is we want to modify this button. So this is what I actually pressed on the disc to make that connection and set the toy off. Now we don't want this peg making contact with our connections and potentially dislodging it. So what I'm going to do is remove this screw and then snip down some of this post, and that will then prevent it from knocking our connections. Now the post that you want to take off is this inside one, and I'm just going to use some snips, and I'm just going to kind of take the top off. Then we can put it back into place and re-secure the screw. Alright, now we can kind of flip the circuit board and take out any extra slack that's inside the toy. And we can replace the two screws that hold the circuit board down. These two screws are a little shorter than the rest, so just make sure you're putting in the right screws back into place. And I would probably use a hand screwdriver so that you don't accidentally over tighten it and crack the circuit board. Next, what we want to do is use a zip tie, and I'm going to wrap this around the cord on the inside of the toy. What this is going to do is basically act like a barrier, so that if someone were to yank on the cord, it prevents the whole cord from just getting ripped out of the toy. So I find the smaller the zip tie, the better, and I'm just going to cinch it down nice and tight, and I'm going to snip off any extra zip tie. And what I like to do for a little extra security is I like to put a little bit of CA glue, or you could use super glue, and put it around the zip tie. That kind of just helps lock it into place. And I can use a little bit of activator, and that will pretty much instantly dry that CA glue. Okay, so now we can start putting it back together, and we can put the feet back together. There's a little post on this top of the leg section that goes into this white part. And the wings have a hole in them, and this post on the back portion of the toy needs to go through the hole and connect to the posts that are on the front portion of the toy. So it's going to take a little bit of lining up. Honestly, this can be sometimes the hardest part of the build. Alright, There we go. Now we can replace all the screws on the back side of the toy. Alright, so now that we've got everything put back together, I turned the toy on and plugged in a button, and let's just test it and make sure that everything works. There we go. Alright, so that's pretty much it. Pretty easy toy to adapt. What's nice is that you've got a lot of different options on which button you want to adapt, or you could just go ahead and adapt all of them if you'd like. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, make sure you hit the like button and hit subscribe to stay up to date on all our latest videos. If you want to find out more about Switch Adapted Toys, you could do so on our website at www.switchtoys.org. There we've got all of our resources kind of in one place. We've got our videos, we've got written manuals, we even have files for you to 3D print your own Switch button, which costs about $5 in parts and materials to make, and is very comparable to the name brand Switches that are out there. If you've got a group or an organization, you could learn about our Switch chapters. That's where we help you adapt toys for kids, kind of on a bigger scale, and help you serve your community in that way. And you can find out more about all this on our website, again, www.switchtoys.org, and I'll put a link in the description below. Lastly, if you are interested in a Switch Adapted Toys, but doing it yourself just isn't your thing, we do have an Etsy shop where we sell some pre-adapted toys that are ready to play with, and the proceeds help support what we're doing here. All the videos that we have on our Etsy shop, we have a free video, how-to video, explaining how to adapt the toy. But again, like if this just isn't your thing, we want to get these toys into as many kids' hands as possible, so you can pick up a pre-adapted toy on our Etsy shop, and I'll put a link in the description below. That's pretty much it. My name is Eric with Switch Adapted Toys, and we'll see you next time.
Switch Adapted Toys, making play possible.